beautiful people. Welcome back to the second hour of Lovebabz Love Talk. Fan favorite, Enroue is here. People love when you come, Enroue. They all tuned in. I can hear the dial going up louder. How are you doing? Happy wind down summer.
Yeah. I'm good. Today is a good day.
Yeah. I haven't been in the streets yet, so yeah. Yeah.
I hope you're not playing in the streets, Babz. That's not
Well,
what you should
it's
be
no
doing.
fun if you're not playing in the streets. On now. Come on. So anyway, Enroue is here. And we like to start off when he's here. It's my favorite thing because he brings us to gather in the prayer chant of his faith. And so I'd appreciate it if you get us started.
Of course. Again, this chant is a Yoruba chant to honor our ancestors, to honor the relationship that continues even after relatives have physically passed away. And our relationship continues, and accessibility and support for our lives continues. And so this chant says, I honor the ashe that they have left. And that ashe that they have left for me, I'm using it today. That ashe are the gifts, the authority, the affinities that we have, the blessings that we have that come from who our people were and how that gets passed on in positive ways. That ashe, I'm honoring them for leaving that. But I'm also honoring, it's also my duty to pick it up, to use it. That's what this chant says. Mama to fun ashe o. Mama to fun ashe. Mama to fun ashe o. Mama to fun ashe. Ashe te fun you. Mama to fun ashe. Ayeye to fun ashe o. Ayeye to fun ashe. Ayeye to fun ashe o. Ayeye to fun ashe. Ashe te fun you. Ayeye to fun. Ba egungun to fun ashe o. Ba egungun to fun ashe. Ba egungun to fun ashe o. To fun ashe te fun you. Ba egungun to fun. Ba egungun to fun. Ba egungun to fun ashe.
Ashe.
Ashe is the things that they have left, but ashe also means may it be so.
May it be
May
so.
may these prayers, may these things that even live as ideas or concepts, unseen realm, may those things manifest and be so. That's what ashe. Ashe at the end of prayers. May these things be so.
May these things be so. So how you doing?
I'm good. I mean, that chant always puts me in a good place. Nice shift, pivot. To really honor the diversity of our relationships and where support also lies, right? Not just in like our brain figuring things out. It's sacred relationships, our relationship with our own people, and our. So there's some thoughts I have.
I love when you have thoughts.
But I always want to also leave space for if there are things that, because you like to play in the streets, sit on the porch, if there are things that you're hearing that would be a good thing for us to pay attention to reflect on a little.
I think what I hear most often is people don't know what to do with all the anxiety of the uncertainty and the amount of violence that
Mm,
is happening in and around us on a daily basis. And I think that's very disconnecting to people, you know.
right. Um, so it's a really important question. Something that's been there's like thoughts and ideas, right, and frameworks and things, but it also really comes down to practices. What practices do we have to connect us to a version of reality and our version of our lives that is bigger than the messages of dehumanization and of violence that we're also experiencing. If we don't have those practices, our default is to consume what this dominant culture says. Because that's what we're raised to do. We're raised to consume what is here as our regular culture. That regular culture, what is considered normal, is full of dehumanizing practices and messages.
Mm.
Are full of systems and institutions, not just like a notion, but like institutions that marginalize some people, elevate others. So we look at the, not to get too theoretical, but to add this little bit of like how far, right, we've come, people, right, who actually had embedded in our cultures ways of navigating difficulty, violence, confusion, chaos, anxiety, depression, trauma, joy, love, celebration. And so this this land, in terms was, or I should say, this country was founded out of like what came out of these British colonies, right? Those British colonies began through real practices of genocide, both genocide on the indigenous people here, and then included genocide of African peoples being kidnapped and brought over. All of these are forms of genocide. And so this land was inhabited by indigenous people, African heritage people had their land, and we were just living our lives and dealing with our own complexities and challenges, right? Nothing was perfect. And then these institutions and practices ripped us from there, brought us here, also ripped us in terms of who have indigenous heritage from here, Native American heritage here, destroyed those things also, right? So it was these institutions were like, well, we want land. There are these people over there, so we're going to take their land. That means we have to get rid of them. And then we need people to work this land so we can be wealthy. We're going to kidnap, practice other things of systems of genocide in them and bring them here. Right? And so this beginning, right, of even like, this is all the beginning of what normal is, right? So it's just good to understand the container that we find ourselves in. The
Hmm.
beginning of this was a dehumanization of one people's of others. And as Black and brown indigenous people, the native people here, like we weren't introduced well together. We were introduced to each other, not based on our own cultures and traditions, right? As earth-based people, as people who had sacred relationships with each other and our family and our ancestors in the land and cultivated those relationships over thousands of years. We weren't introduced to each other in that way. Like, oh, hi, I'm a visitor, you're a visitor, like welcome, these are how we do it, this is how we do it, right? That's how you greet people when you're honoring yourself and honoring who they are. And that's not how we were introduced to each other, how African heritage people and Native American people were introduced to each other. It was all through the lens of white supremacy and this kind of settler colonial mentality, which was about land for some people to get rich and then dehumanization of some bodies so that those same people could become rich. That's the first landscape of what was planted and seeded and fostered to make eventually this United States, right? Other people and systems are getting dehumanized and oppressed. Half of what was Mexico became erased and captured and taken by this expansion of manifest destiny states. The impact on lots of different Black and brown people. And so then we, as African heritage people, right, we are, the way that slavery happened here is we were, anything that was traditional was eliminated, right? Traditional family structures, sacred literature, ways of connecting, sorry, not eliminated, but were attacked, right, by these systems of slavery. So anything that was African was eliminated and beaten out of people, but also there became this process of, in the United States, which was different than the Caribbean, of breeding people, right? So there wasn't as much of like the influx of African peoples into these systems to remind people, to remind us as African heritage people about where we come from, how we think of things, what it means to be a person. So over generations, right, we're kind of subsumed deeper and deeper into this colonial mentality package, and this package of white supremacy. And so fast forward, not to walk through every little step, here we are today, right? And we've internalized notions of what it means to be successful, what it means to make it in this country, what do we need to survive, what do we need to thrive. And unless we have practices that recenter our personhood, we then take on these practices that have come out of these deep systems of oppression and dehumanization, certain people being less than, certain people being greater than, forgetting that we are still on land that was stolen, land that was, treaties were made and then the United States just decided not to follow through with treaties, right? Erasure of people. Land that continued to dehumanize our inherent personhood as African heritage people. So that's the like container that we find ourselves in, right? So, here's all this violence happening. Here's continued dehumanization. Here's continued oppression that happens. Here's an undoing of these systems of structure and democracy that are also happening. And that's in a continuum of the destruction that had happened as soon as the Spanish first sent people to colonize this part of the world. And so that's continued. And so we have to practices to find our way back to that inherent personhood are important. So, how do I not try to find my inherent personhood through Instagram, through TikTok, Facebook, through Netflix, through Hulu, through Disney Plus, right? Through drugs and alcohol, through overconsumption of sex, through over-consuming, or that my identity is about what I consume, or my identity being solely linked to where in this kind of status piece around work, around professionality, around education I am. If we rely on those things without these other awarenesses of our personhood, we are then just kind of following in lockstep with the supporting of these dehumanizing ways of being. So we won't find peace there because those practices have some inherent hook in them about numbing ourselves out. Things are too difficult. I don't want to pay attention to this discomfort. I don't have practice to lean into something greater than that. So these, for me, these practices I have, these Yoruba practices and traditions, ways of thinking about my relationship to my ancestors that are also connected to the traditions of my ancestors before there was whiteness, before there was blackness, right? Before there was kind of these colonial patterns that were instilled in me. Not that I have to go backwards, but if I need to start being curious and questioning what I think is just fundamental and what is normal. If I won't find my way out systems. Now, all this to say, it doesn't mean that just because you have these practices, you will never feel anxious, you will never feel depressed, those are normal things. When the world around us, the circumstances around us are overwhelming and scary, it's appropriate to feel overwhelmed and scared. That's just like, oh, look, here you are. I'm playing in the street. A truck is coming towards me. I should feel nervous and scared so I can get out of the way. That's rational. It's not that, oh, the truck is coming towards me. I feel so at peace. I can just be here with the truck and we can somehow just share the space and they'll recognize my personhood and I'll just, no, you're in the street and the truck's coming and may not see you, get out of the way. Like, that's the normal response. And if we can be present, if we can hold these notions of our personhood, then we can skillfully address what is actually happening. Oh, do I need to increase my awareness of like what's happening? Hey, do I need to connect with other people and do some like community organizing and mobilizing? Do I need to like get off social media and put my phone down for a little bit and like go outside? Right? Oh, outside doesn't feel safe, so maybe I create a space inside. What are these practices that I have to bring myself back to the present, to investigate and be curious about what it means to be a person, what it means to not grab onto what is normally spoon-fed or handed to us. I notice my own patterns. And can I be also generous and passionate to myself? Oh, look, I'm following into these old patterns. All right, let me pause. Let me develop some other coping skills, some other strategies. Let me heal what needs to be healed so that I can even just see clearly, so I'm not just triggered all the time. A news story doesn't trigger my own trauma that I experienced at 12 because I never addressed that. Maybe I don't need to consume every little thing I see. Maybe I need to be more discerning about what I'm taking, or have some other understanding so it doesn't feel just random and chaotic. It's like, oh, there are threads of like how government works and things are often chaotic and changing, right? And I don't think anyone could deny that. And the system is also built to support some of that, right? Who gets punished and how and who doesn't? That still filters through the system, right? Oh, somehow, land owning wealthy white men somehow get different punishment from everybody else. That seems very similar to like how this country was actually founded. Not so different. What are then my practices that help me to find place for me to be a person? That doesn't mean I have to assimilate into that culture. What are my practices? What am I open to? Can I really, as a Black person, can I look at how anti-Blackness lives in me in ways that is challenging to look at what African religions and practices are? How is like anti-Blackness wrapped up in that? Like if my notion of Blackness in this country begins in the institution of slavery, to me, that's a distortion of like the reality, right? Because what makes us Black here is our African heritage. So if we can't actually be open to our people there, they actually have something to offer us. If I dehumanize them because of these notions of settler colonialism, Africa is this dark, primitive, oh yes, they don't know anything, right? If I'm replicating that, I'm walking in step with a system that dehumanizes me. So how can I ever find my personhood if I myself am denying where I come from and who my people actually are? Doesn't mean I have to have those exact same practices, but if I can't even open up to the validity of thousands of years of people, how people lived and thrived, a problem. There's a hurt there because of the trauma of this institution of slavery. So how can we go in and heal that? Find, if a door has been closed to us because of these systems, right? No, you can't have these practices. You can't have these, the culture of, let's say, the drum, for example, exists in the United States, completely different from throughout the Caribbean and other parts of the African diaspora because of how that aspect of Africanness prevented here. Rhythm, right, still found its way into here, like how we use our bodies, how we use song, right? But as an instrument, a fundamental part of our culture, that was eliminated here. So, what happens when people start to hear drumming now? Oh, some people are like, what's that noise? Or like, that's primitive, whatever. It's an ancient thing, right? It's not relevant. That's us buying into this message that we've been fed and been beaten into our bodies about what it means to be Black here in this country.
Wow. Oh,
You know, some things to muse about, right? But to
it's
get back,
a listen. At any point in all that you said, all I kept thinking was, I don't know how, we, first of all, I don't know how we feel in the hurt. I don't know if we could collectively do that, or everybody individually has to work on their path about this hurt. Second, how do we think about our own anti-blackness in our everyday living as Black people? How do we do that? And how do we check ourselves when it shows up? And it shows up. It shows up even in the best of us. That's number two. Number three, there's so much that we have to learn about who we were prior to, and how do we bring that forward to the day? How do we bring that forward? And number four, I know that we spend a lot of time taking the church from what it was used against us and making our own. We have a history of taking what was done to us and repurposing it, making it our own so that it doesn't hurt as much. But I got to tell you, it still hurts. And so how do you combat the messages of fire and brimstone with what you need? Because I feel like there's something else at work that we need, that isn't about the church, isn't about worship. It isn't about it. It is a reconnecting to something that we've long since lost, but it is in us. I do believe Blackness is very much, Africanness is very much in us. In us. It is, I think it's in us. And when I look at people around the world, when I travel, I see the commonalities. I see us, the way we move, the way we talk, the way we are with one another. That hasn't been beaten out of us.
right?
There's a lot of things that have not been beaten out of us. There's a lot of things that have survived.
Yes. I don't want people to think that what I'm saying is like all has been lost.
Oh no, I don't
Right?
I don't get that you're saying that. I'm getting that we have to go look.
Exactly. Well, and if we don't, right? If we don't feed, if we don't, so the question about the church is complicated,
It is very complicated,
right?
but
So
I see a path in there that I feel something else about that.
So I think, so actually, before we get into that, the first thing, the message that I've often gotten connected to my ancestors, being in the woods and being present with, like, oh, here's the pain of like clear cutting and oppression and police violence, right? All the things. The first message when I'm in those places of, so for me, like being in nature is a nourishing place, right? Which by itself in this country, the complexity of Black people in nature is
Yes.
both because of white supremacy and like, well, that's just for like white folks and their preciousness, but also, we've had some real traumatic experiences in nature, both by being enslaved people, by being hunted, right? All kinds of awfulness, right? And so, and it's a place that, like, to me, can hold the complexity of who we are without telling us who we need to be. Like, I get to go sit on a rock by a tree, and there's no gaze at me telling me how I should or shouldn't behave. Right? All that comes out of me, right? And so, but this message of, before we shift into fixing, right? Because I actually heard, like, the first things were like, okay, so what do we do, right? Is we have to feel. And can we go into the spaces that we feel like we can lean into a little bit and allow ourselves to feel it first? And that's that place of going into healing. And that's where these practices, to me, are really aren't theoretical, right? It's literally like, I mean, whether it's therapy, whether it's in the woods, whether it's even before we get into like indigenous practices and what that means, and how do we as Black people go into indigenous practices that are ours and don't replicate commodification of like Indian things, right? That's also important. Whatever those practices are that we can lean into and have some respite from and some support, can we allow ourselves to really feel the pain, feel the terror? No, and teasing apart, like I feel that it's not happening right now. This place, feel it, right? And so that is that's a way that we start to undo those distortions of like of historic trauma, racial trauma, cultural trauma, into how can I be present in these places of support so I can address that pain from the clarity of the present round of like, oh, here I am, versus like, it feels like I'm somewhere else. Okay, it can feel like that, but it's not necessarily true or accurate that that's literally what's happening. And that's the distinctions are important, right? I know the greater risk I have of playing in the streets, being in the world, right? And if I'm not in that, I don't need to feel as if I am. Right? Otherwise, like the places of peace and restoration don't become that. They get filled with like, but at any time something could happen. That's a trauma response.
Yeah,
right?
it is. And
Oh,
it
but
is
over
so,
there, the
yes.
murder is happening. Yeah, over there. And I got to deal with that. But right now, it's not. So can I find some ground? Can I find that rootedness? Right? And so before getting into the complexity of practices, just like where's the place that I feel some agency, some peace, and then can I bring these complexities into that place? And then that place can expand. And then you can start to ask questions around like, oh, what does it mean that there's this thing called the doctrine of discovery, which I've been reading about more, right? Which is literally what the Pope, the authority the Pope gave to Spain and Portugal and other countries,
yes,
to go somewhere where there were people and said, well, they're not Christians, they're not
let's,
people, take the land, it's yours.
yeah.
Take the people, they're yours, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's like the 1400s, right? And that has never been kind of repudiated even by the church. They say that like, well, it's not relevant now, but like it's never, no one's ever said like, wow, that was really bad idea, that was really harmful, that was really oppressive, right? So that's like the beginning piece, which was actually about wealth and land control and accumulation. It wasn't just like a theology, like, this is just what God is saying. It was like, oh, we want land and wealth. Here's the justification for that. They are not people. Go take the land, go take the people. And that's how people landed on these shores, and that's how African people got taken from those shores. So that's like a real thing that came out of the church. And that position has been justified and used in the United States, in US law, for policies and practices to
You are
maintain,
absolutely right.
right? To maintain control, right? So can people who are Christians also hold that, right? That part of doctrine continues to pan out in practices and policies, in dehumanizing people, government policies, but also in like relationship policies of like, oh, who's a good person, who's not a good person, who's a human, who's not a human, and the role of this is the one right way, which is not, I mean, not an indigenous practice, right? There's like, oh, this is our way, and if you want to come here and like join our way, that's fine. And if you don't, well, then that's okay too. Like you're not our people, but you're not a person. This is how we do it here, and this is what works here in relationship with spirits, our land, right? How we grow things, how we relate to each other. And oh, we could even what's that? It works for you, and you got from this other place and these other things. You live by the ocean, we don't. We don't even know what that is. Sure, that's bring that tradition in here. We'll fold it in because we're welcoming you as our people. So like you can fold that in. That's not white supremacy. That's not this kind of colonial colonizer mentality, right? That's not that. That's not monoculture. Like we just need to grow corn and sugarcane and tobacco and rum to like make money and deplete the land, right? That's that version, right? And so getting into those complexities means, can I look at where do my notions of blackness start and stop? My people. So I have a lot of my ancestors who were like deep in the church in positions of leadership, and really hasn't been my own practice. And I've really like wrestled even with like, what has it meant for people as I have worked to kind of find my way kind of back to these earth-centered traditions that can feel like, well, like Christianity is this like settler religion that has done so much harm and even continues to dehumanize, right, these traditional African practices today, right? There's genocide of indigenous traditions that happen today, aren't like ancient things. So coming to terms with these are also the language and technologies, like people want meaning and people seek connection to the divine and base that on the language and culture that they're embedded in. So if everything else but Christianity was allowed, then Christianity becomes the tradition and the culture and the language to connect with the divine. So that was this place of, in the midst of trauma, how do we find our way with this knowledge, right? With this book, with this sacred book, right? Sacred teachings in the Bible. How do we find our personhood in that, right? Through, even as it's used to dehumanize us, how do we kind of find our personhood in that, right? And that's powerful and that's resilient and that's continues that relationship with the sacred. And there's a deep level of forgetting that happens and that happened with that. And so how do we remember? And then still, if it's holding that tradition and that practices with that remembering, great. If it's like, ooh, now I have to question, what does that mean for me if I'm able to really remember and include this personhood, right? So it's like in terms of ancestor practice, if I dehumanize, right? If I say, well, they had this other practice and that's evil or sin or whatever it is, right? Is like not good. Then I'm actually cutting that off from me, from my wholeness.
I think Enroue, I think that's where people go along and they feel that that's not right. Maybe not right. Yeah. Maybe right is not the word, but they go along because for them, the greater story is about keep my eyes on Christ. And I can swallow all the other stuff where Black and that intersects. I was somewhere the other night and I heard a minister say something that I couldn't divorce myself from it because it felt so divisive to me. And I thought, we are constantly asked to divide ourselves and our holy loyalties in ways that nobody else is asked to do. We're still doing that.
So it's partly because, and this is like tender and sensitive and like not easy conversations, right? So much of that faith and tradition is tied up with these same systems of oppression. And so what's hard, I think, in some conversations I've had with other Black people is like a challenge to me. Like, how can I lump, for example, this like settler colonialism or white supremacy, how can I lump Christianity and black church and Black Christianity in that same bowl? Like, that seems like absurd and disrespectful and demeaning of people who really found their way to this connection to the divine and wholeness, right? And to me, it's not just this easy, like, well, here's the box, and if you're in this, you kind of get thrown in here. But can we admit to the reality that this system and these traditions have played and continue to play? Can we just do that, right? This divisiveness that you're talking about, right? can we feel into that and understand that not everything everywhere, but like there are ways that this practice has been a part of the enslavement of our people as an explicit tool. And yes, we can like find the silver lining and find our way, and we're still kind of in the same soup of like, well, I'll take this but not that, and like I have to, like, the managing that happens, which fundamentally parses up ourselves.
Yes.
What if I feel this other thing? But what about my ancestors who weren't a part of this? Does that mean they're like in hell, or they're bad? And does that mean that if I connect my ancestors, then I'm that too? And like it creates that kind of dilemma, right? And that's complicated. There's healing that needs to happen in there. There's not this kind of blanket good or bad, right? Because it's also around like, what access did people have? And so we did this, and we went this way, and we took this. And you know, the reality for me is like, those had the church spoken to me in the way that Orisha, in the ways that like being connected to the earth itself and these sacred forces connect to me, I would have been in there, right? I come from a line of folks that are ministers and pastors and doing all things. I would have gone that route, like, because to me, being in a relationship with the divine is part of my purpose. And so, and I explored that language, and I explored those ways, and I was like, this isn't it. There's something over here. And I looked at the Quran, and I was like, no, and I want to, because like, look at all my people who are all wrapped up in these things, and I could be, and like, no. And so even now in the work I do in my ancestors, they're like, you know, you can't control how the divine speaks to you.
Right. That is very true.
Right.
I agree wholeheartedly.
But can we take whatever that is and still explore really what our wholeness is, which means looking outside of like what gets packaged and delivered to us. And that's not easy. And if we're trying to be free, then we have to look at these things. If I want to be free, I have to look at, how does male supremacy show up? How does it show up in indigenous traditions? How does it show up in my day-to-day? I have to look at that. And I got to look at how does homophobia show up? Because if I participate in it, right, that is also dehumanizing to me. If I'm participating in male supremacy, that's actually dehumanizing to me, because it says, well, maleness is this thing, and you want to be this thing. Because if you're not, you could be hurt, you could be less than, right? There's very real consequences. In terms of blackness, whoa, I'm light, so I get these benefits, but not those benefits. And and all that navigating is still within, colorism is still within the bowl of white supremacy and this kind of settler colonial mentality. We didn't do that traditionally. It was like, oh, hi, person of different shades. But here it became, right, life and death, access, not access. Who wields power? Who gets a little bit of an edge so that things are a little bit easier? So we have to, in the present, continue to have that like self-critical with compassion lens on. What am I perpetuating? What am I not? How can I even really see my own wholeness? What have I internalized? Not just what's coming at me and I'm a victim, right? Because there's that piece around like, well, as a black person, or even as someone who's embedded in the church, I'm still a victim, so I can't be perpetuating any kind of oppression. Well, to this day, right, if you're a Christian, you have a level, whatever race, color, ethnicity, gender you are, you have a level of privilege than if you're something else. And the further you are away from that, the less access to resources, less personhood you are also kind of is bestowed upon you, right? You can find your way in your practices. Like, I feel whole, and I still have to deal with how others deal with me. Right.
Yes, it has been a wonderful conversation, as always. So much to unpack, so much to take. I enjoyed it. I've heard some things that I needed to hear, and I so appreciate it. You know, sometimes you hear things that keep you on your path, and sometimes you hear things that like, oh no, go over there. So thank you for being a lamppost today. I appreciate it.
Well, I hope it landed in some real, and landed in ways that people can take it in.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. So I appreciate you. And don't worry, y'all. He'll be back. We'll have more conversations. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
I will. You too. Well,
All
we're
right.
not quite there, but I will.
I'm
Get through the week first.
I'm done.
All right. The weekend starts now.
Thank you.
All right. Take care now.
All right.